I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Omni viewer, and I know this isn't how I usually do the Primal videos, but it is nighttime. I literally just finished watching the latest episode, The Primal Theory, and I had a feeling, based on the fact that no footage was available of it in the preview from last week, that I would have to do some kind of, right after reaction. Usually, I sleep on it, I watch the episode, I let it ruminate overnight, and then I come back in the morning. But this time I felt like I had to, or at least I would probably have to do a reaction as soon as it was done. And that is precisely what I'm doing. It's still going up the day after, but, I'm filming it in here because I can't rely on the natural daylight coming in through the window right now. So, yeah, just stick with me for this particular format. And obviously spoilers are going to follow, and this time the spoilers are something else. So, really, if you have not seen this episode, The Primal Theory, yet, stop watching now and come back when you've seen it. So, otherwise, let's get into it, because The Primal Theory is officially unlike any other episode of Primal to date. I don't think any of us were expecting this. I don't think, why would we expect it? There was no way we could have. All of a sudden we have this huge time skip to 1890 in England, where these upper crust English gentlemen of scientific backgrounds are discussing this, they're discussing the primal theory essentially, and then find themselves trapped in a scenario that's like one half Hammer horror movie and one half 80s slasher movie, where a deranged psychopath is loose in the mansion and stalking after them. And there's actual dialogue in this, dialogue that the primary Western audience for this series would understand. It's in English. The characters are speaking in a language that I understand. Everything is different. I'm not even sure where to begin with this one, because, it was shocking. Honestly, it was shocking. But that's not to say it was bad, mind you. I'm not saying it was shocking in a bad way. Somebody actually on Twitter posted something like the day leading up to the premiere of this episode, saying that, without spoiling anything, this person thought I'd be disappointed by the episode and that I should lower my expectations. My instinct was to say, how the heck would you know? Nobody has seen the episode yet, but I didn't respond. I just let it go. And, I don't know what that person was talking about, quite honestly. I'm not disappointed. I'm stunned, I'm confused, but I'm not disappointed, not by a long shot. And I didn't even lower my expectations. So anyway, where to begin? Gonna have to think about that for a minute. Okay, so the choice to suddenly jump ahead, like I said, it's set entirely in 1890, where we have these British gentlemen, all of them older scientists, with one somewhat younger scientist, it's implied, discussing the nature of man and then finding themselves confronted with a monster who is undeniably human. And as they were doing that, I actually did get a little scared. Not scared of the scenario, like I was hiding behind the couch or anything, but scared of what the twist could be. Because as they're discussing this, they're talking about how man is no different from the ape, and it is possible that man can revert back to a primitive state, and I'll speak more on that later. But as they're talking about that, a constable walks in and he warns them that a deranged killer has escaped from the local lunatic asylum and he's on the loose, and they need to be wary of him. And as soon as they said that, I immediately thought, no, they wouldn't pull a stunt like that, would they? Because I was worried that it was possible that when we saw the deranged killer, it would turn out to be Spear. And the twist would be that Spear was just hallucinating this whole time and he's really just a lunatic. Thank God they did not go in that direction, but I was concerned because, I mean, I've seen it happen too many times where people do the whole "it was all a hallucination" twist, and I have no doubt that somebody's going to make a theory that's going to be exactly to that effect. I don't think that's going to be the case because, first of all, pretty sure they would have made it clear by the end, and second, there's no way that a show like this would do that. Genndy Tartakovsky would not spend a season and a half getting us invested in these characters and the world they lived in and building up an emotional bond between the audience and the characters we see and then tell us it was all fake. I could not believe that. I didn't want to believe it. And there was a moment where I was worried I might have no choice but to accept it as fact. But not the case. The psychopath does have a few very general physical similarities to Spear, like he's really big and bulky, he's barely got any definition between his legs and his feet, things like that, but I think it's pretty clear it's not Spear at all. It was just meant to be a sort of visual cue that this guy is behaving in a very primitive state, and that was part of the whole theme. But I just had to get that out of the way. Like, that was a legitimate concern of mine in the first few minutes of this episode. And I am so happy they didn't actually go with that. Whew, yeah, that's a relief. Anyway, what else to discuss? The way the story actually plays out is interesting. I mean, it's not necessarily the most groundbreaking idea of having people trapped in a house with a being that wants to kill them. I mean, you could technically say that this episode is basically Victorian-era Alien, except instead of a xenomorph, it's a psychopath. But that's not to say, again, that it's bad. I mean, you know, there's that old saying, there's nothing new under the sun. It's not about how original you can make something per se, it's more about what you do with the material you've got. And they did some good stuff with this. It's very atmospheric, it's very intense, and they even find a way to not really have it rely on the dialogue, even though dialogue is a huge part of it. I suppose I should talk about that too. Like, I am surprised they actually decided to have an episode with a language that most people would understand. I do know that, like, Mira is speaking Persian or some Middle Eastern dialect, and the Celts in the one episode in season 2 were speaking Old Gaelic, I believe, or some such language. There are real languages in Primal that we've heard, but for all intents and purposes, they are dialects that would be known by very few people in the audience that would be watching this thing, so it may as well be no dialogue at all. But now we have an episode that is in English, and that's to convey a particular thematic point. And again, like I said, I will get to that, but the primary idea here is that apparently this was considered important enough that the audience had to have it explained to them clearly. This wasn't something that could be conveyed visually, so at least not entirely visually. They had to provide at least some setup that was dialogue based, and they knew when to do it. At least I think. I mean, I haven't seen the whole season yet, so I don't know exactly how well timed this episode is, but it's like we've gotten to a certain point, now we need to just lay out some stuff for you. And it didn't feel like it over-explained. It didn't feel like it was full-blown exposition. It felt natural. They found a natural way to introduce this stuff through the character of Charles. Now, the series does not say outright that Charles is Charles Darwin. There are certainly several cues pointing to that. He holds up the chart with the finches. That's a major thing of Darwinism. He is talking about evolution in a way, and yet it's not precisely that. He's not talking about creatures just evolving. He's also speaking about de-evolving, and how, well, he's, like I said, he's setting up the theme for the episode where mankind, yes, mankind has adapted, mankind has evolved, mankind is civilized, but under the right circumstances, regression can happen. It's actually kind of a Lovecraftian idea, not necessarily presented as Lovecraft would have done it per se, but one of the things H.P. Lovecraft liked to write about quite a bit that doesn't get discussed as often as other themes he did was this idea of de-evolution. The idea that mankind, in the right circumstances, could regress into something grotesque and animalistic. Sometimes that played into the metaphor for his own racial hang-ups. Sometimes it was just another form of horror. Like, one of the first stories he ever wrote was called The Cave, in which a guy gets lost while he's in a spelunking crew exploring a cave. He's stalked by a monster. When the rest of the people catch up to him, they find that the monster was a former human being who got lost on a spelunking expedition that was in the cave before. So that was a serious theme that really spoke to Lovecraft. And it's kind of played into here, but in a different way because, well, guess I may as well get into the themes of it then, won't I? Okay, so the biggest shock to me about this episode, after I adjusted to the fact that we were now in a completely different setting with completely different characters, was that the episode never ties in narratively to the rest of the series. Like, there's no flashback to the prehistoric time or whenever Primal is set. It doesn't suddenly end with a twist that it was all an alternate history and Primal is actually set in the far-flung future. It doesn't tie in at all from a narrative standpoint. This episode, The Primal Theory, is 100% self-contained. That being said, it does tie in from a thematic standpoint. The basic thesis of this whole episode is that mankind can potentially regress from his upright, civilized self to something more primal. That is the primal theory. The idea that you can regress back to a more primitive state. But it's not necessarily presented the way Lovecraft presented it, like I said. When Lovecraft presented it, it was a form of horror. It was a form of how horrible it is that mankind could get to this state and then be reduced to nothing. Here, the message seems to be more in the vein of, it's necessary. Like, mankind needs to regress. This is where we get away from Lovecraft and more into the realm of Robert E. Howard and maybe even a little Edgar Rice Burroughs, because there is that sense of you need to be primitive in order to survive. As long as our protagonists in this episode are fighting against the psychopath using modern means, whether it's to simply run away and try to find a way of escape, which is the most sensible thing they could do, or arming themselves with the best weapons they have available, like guns and whatnot, they are always on the back foot in that regard. They are not winning. They are slowly getting picked off one by this guy who's acting like a wild gorilla. It's not until one of their ranks decides he's had enough, and the only way to defeat a barbarian is to become a barbarian, and even be worse, that's when victory comes, which is why, at the very end, after the psycho has been defeated in the most brutal fashion, Charles stares for a moment and then says, "And there you have it!" Because that's the point of the episode. That you could say might be the point of the whole series. Because here's the interesting thing. The preview for the next episode clearly sets up that Spear and Fang and Mira are going to encounter the Viking chief and his, I guess, son, whatever that offspring is. They're going to meet in the next episode. So this is not going to be drawn out for very long. And even though Spear has been advancing gradually over the course of this season, like he drops the spear, picks up a sword and a shield, even though he's gotten to that point, he's still not quite as advanced as these Vikings are, or any other human being we've seen at this point. He is still very much a primitive man. And I think the episode is telling us that's what he needs to be. Even as he is advancing, even as he is becoming something more, at some point, he's gonna have to just let go of that. We kind of saw that in the previous episode, actually, Red Mist, where you could say that the primary reason that Spear and Fang were able to win against these Vikings, even though the odds were against them, was because they are more animalistic. So the Primal theory is the episode that basically spells out the main theme of the whole series. Now, whether or not that was necessary, who can say? It certainly made for a different episode. Whether or not that was necessary, like I said, it's difficult to say at this point because we haven't seen the whole thing. And who knows? Maybe this stuff will somehow tie in later. Or maybe it was just a narrative non sequitur purely for the sake of presenting the themes plainly. But whatever the case, I mean, this was the episode nobody saw coming. And, well, it certainly switched things up. I guess you could say that the narrative switch-up was necessary in its own right because you don't necessarily want Primal to get stale. You don't necessarily want to go through the whole thing having it be that same way of, like, you don't want it to be formulaic. So they threw this in to throw us a curveball, get our minds jumbled of, wait a minute, now I have to adjust to something that's more conventional? What the heck? So that when it goes back to the standard formula, we'll be like, oh yeah, I remember now why this works so well. We'll see how well it works. I mean, I still think Primal's a great show, but the season's not over yet. Anything can happen. Literally at this point, I think we can safely say anything can happen, because this happened. And this was totally out of left field, at least in terms of narration, like I said. But anyway, yeah, that's the Primal theory, and there you have it. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni viewer signing off.
Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books: Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.